Welcome back. In this lecture, we are going to understand about the null resource. Okay, so null resource will be used in combination with the provisioners. So we'll see why and then what is this null resource, what is null provider, and what is time provider. All those things we are going to look into. So we are going to implement a very good use case here. So before going and then understanding about the use case, we need to understand about a null provider, null resource, and then time provider. So let's start with the null provider. Okay, so the null provider is a unusual provider that has constructs that intentionally do nothing. This may sound strange, and indeed these constructs do not need to be used in most cases, but in Terraform for few specific use cases there will be a need for using the null resources. So for that purpose, using the null resources, you need to add the null provider in place. Okay, so if you add the null provider in your c1 versions.tf, so if you go here in null resource and in c1 versions.tf, so if you add the null provider, then you can start using the null resource. Okay, so the null resource implements the standard resource lifecycle but takes further no action. Okay, so example, you see this is the resource and here you can see the null resource. So in null resource, ideally there is no specific thing you can, means like it is not creating anything in the remote infrastructure. Okay, it is trying to do some other stuff whatever we want to be done. Primarily null resource 99% of the cases we use for assigning to the provisioners, means like you have a provisioner job which really doesn't need to be associated with any of the existing instances, okay, or existing resources or existing live resources in the remote cloud. Okay, at that point of time, those provisioner jobs you can assign to a null resource and then run it. Okay, so example, you are getting the cluster instance IDs here. Okay, inside this null resource you defined a to get the cluster instance IDs using this trigger, or you can run some remote exec provisioner using null resource and then get some information from your respective cluster. Okay, so whatever it is, but primarily null resource 99% of the cases you will associate with your provisioners. Okay, to do some job which really doesn't need to be inside the real resource, so you can run it under null resource and then get the information whatever we need. So that's about the null provider and then null resource. Now we'll also discuss about provisioners without a resource. That is nothing but provisioners without a resource is nothing but defining provisioners inside a null resource. So whatever we have discussed just now. And another thing here is time provider. So time provider will have the following resources. The time provider is used to interact with time-based resources. The provider itself has no configuration options. So inside this time provider, we are going to use the time sleep resource. Okay, so using this time sleep resource, so we are going to wait for 90 seconds after the EC2 instance is created. So what happens in that 90 seconds, our whatever the web server will be provisioned on that EC2 instance, and after that we'll go to null resource, and inside null resource we are going to define the provisioners. So let's see the complete use case now. Okay, so in this use case we are going to force a resource to update based on changed null resource. Okay, so force a resource to update based on changed null resource. So we'll see more into it in a detailed manner. Okay, so the title looks a little bit different, but force a resource to update based on changed null resource. So we are going to force a resource to update based on changed null resource. So always whenever null resource keeps updating with a timestamp, so whenever you run Terraform apply, null resource will get updated. So in which use case this will be helpful is, so we'll see in the down steps. Okay, so create time sleep resource to wait for 90 seconds after EC2 instance creation. So this is what we are going to do as the first thing. Okay, hand in hand we are going to review the files here. Okay, c1 version.tf we have added the null provider and also the time provider. So both providers we have added in the versions.tf, and then we'll move on to c4 ec2 instance.tf, and then start discussing. Okay, so create time sleep resource to wait for 90 seconds after EC2 instance creation. Okay, so now your first thing here is you will create a AWS EC2 instance, and then you will provision the web server inside that. But as soon as the EC2 instance is created, immediately next instance whatever is there, it will start get creating, right? So at that point of time, so let's remove this 90 seconds wait. So you are creating a null resource here. Okay, and inside this null resource you are making a connection to that respective EC2 instance whatever you have created, and you are copying the app1 folder to the temp folder, and from temp folder again using remote exec provisioner you are copying to var3w HTML, right? So now if Apache web server is not installed, then this null resource thing is going to fail, right? So for that purpose you will add something called time sleep wait for 90 seconds, and this depends on this one. Okay, so once this instance is created, this resource will trigger and then it will wait for 90 seconds. Okay, so once the 90 seconds is completed, then it will go to the next resource, which is a null resource, and inside this null resource again you have a depends on attribute waiting for this resource. Only if time sleep resource is created, then only this resource will trigger. Okay, and another important thing here is, so let's go back here and create a null resource with required provisioners. So provisioners we have discussed here, connection block and file provisioner, and then from file provisioner to remote exec provisioner, same as in our previous sections. Okay, so we'll copy the app1 folder to /temp, and from /temp using remote exec provisioner you are going to run it and then do the copy immediately. Okay, to var3w HTML. Okay, now here one important thing for us here is triggers always updates is equal to timestamp. Okay, so what does this mean is every time whenever you run the Terraform apply or plan, so it will update the timestamp for this resource, so that every time you will find whenever you run the Terraform apply you will find the change. Okay, so whenever always for every timestamp it will change, so which means for every timestamp whenever you run the Terraform apply, these provisioners are going to run, which means it will connect to EC2 instance and copy the app1 folder from your local to that location, and then copy from there to your web server. So now what is happening here, if you understand in detail, what is happening here is without touching the real EC2 instance resource, right? So you are copying your static content to that EC2 instance using null resource. Okay, so that's the core use case here. The core use case is this one. Okay, force a resource to update based on changed null resource. Okay, so you are forcing a resource inside this, means like the content inside this resource you are deploying without touching this instance, and then using null resource, using timestamp you are updating your static content. So how you write the logic without impacting the existing services is the important thing. So at that point of time null resource will be a helpful thing for you. So now always if you want to update the static content, if you add these things here, right? So if you add these things inside this, always it will be an update to your respective EC2 instance. If it is a critical infrastructure and then it is hosting lot of other stuff, right? How does it look like? If it is update, that is fine, but if something goes wrong, what is the story? If something goes wrong with this null resource, what is the impact? Only with the null resource, not with the critical real cloud based instance. This completes the introductory part of null resource, null provider, time provider, and also review of the manifest whatever required as part of this use case. Okay, so in our next lecture we are going to go ahead and then execute the Terraform commands and then see the outputs. So I'll see you in the next lecture. Until then, bye bye. Thank you.